Mariam Rastanpour and Marzia Emirzadeh were both born into Muslim families. They didn't know each other when they were young, but individually as children, they had something in common. And that is they were both on a quest to uncover the truth about God. They had a thirst inside of them that was very genuine and very real. In their schools, they were taught that Jesus Christ was a prophet, but they didn't know him personally. And through a series of circumstances, I believe God-ordained circumstances, each of them individually was brought to a personal faith in Jesus. That involved some individuals, that involved some books that they uncovered, and a variety of experiences, even in their dreams. But both of them, and this is so true, and you'll pick up on this in just a moment, were captivated by a love for Jesus. And it was an incredible experience, and they both wanted to learn more. So they ended up moving to Turkey so that they could study theology, and they met each other there in 2005, and that's where they figured out that both of them had come to faith about the same time, about 6 years prior to that. They decided to join forces after they studied theology to go back to Iran and to begin a very intentional program of outreach. In just 3 years, they had covertly distributed over 20,000 New Testaments in the Farsi language. We have a map of Tehran. It's a sprawling city of 7 million people, and you can see how intentional they were and all the different places that they distributed New Testaments. They also started 2 secret house churches in their apartment. One was for young people, and the other one was for prostitutes. This was a group for poor, divorced, or widowed women who turned to prostitution in order to stay alive and in order to feed their children. And they called that group Mary Magdalene. Perhaps inevitably, in 2009, these ladies were arrested in Tehran for promoting Christianity, which is a capital crime in Iran. For 259 days, Mariam and Marzia were held in the notorious Evin prison. This is a place where inmates are routinely tortured and executions are swift and sudden. The official charges against these young women were apostasy, anti-government activity, and blasphemy, for which they were sentenced to execution by hanging. But something remarkable happened during those 8 months. In the book, there's a foreword by Anne Graham Lotz, and these are her words. She says, "Inside the dark hell of Evin prison, Mariam and Marzia turned on the light. Their love for the least, their kindness to the roughest, their willingness to serve in the dirtiest place imaginable is truly a stunningly clear reflection of the Jesus they love, as well as evidence of his presence inside those walls." Mariam and Marzia endured chilling interrogations and horrific conditions. Both of them became very ill during part of their time in prison, and yet, they continued to share their faith. As many around the world prayed for their freedom, and as a result of international lobbying from groups such as Amnesty International, Mariam and Marzia were released, and they were cleared of all the charges the following year. They went to Turkey, and eventually they immigrated to the United States. Now they live in Atlanta, Georgia. Would you please join me in extending a very warm welcome and a way to go to Mariam and Marzia. Well, I mentioned that before they were arrested, these ladies were leading 2 house churches, which is a very risky thing to do, and one of them was for prostitutes. Why did you feel compelled to minister to these women? And tell us a little bit about how vulnerable so many women are in Iran.
Yes, I have to explain a little about women's situation in Iran. It's been over 30 years that we have an Islamic government, and women are the groups that are under so much pressure from this government and because of the Islamic rules. I don't know how much you know about Islam and the rules against women, but if you read the Quran, you can see that women are under so much pressure, and most of these Islamic rules targets women. For example, in the Quran, there are verses that says husbands can beat their wives, and they can have more than one wife. They call it temporary marriage. There is a contract that they can sign. There is a paper that they can sign, and they can marry a woman for a few hours, for days, for weeks, and there is an expiration date for that contract. And we always say that it's a legal prostitution, and in Iran, prostitution is completely different from other countries because there's no specific place for women in Iran, and you never know who is doing this prostitution. And most women believe that they are just following God's rules because they act according to the Quran, to their holy book, and they believe that it is acceptable by God to marry a man for a few hours, for a few weeks or months. So it was difficult to approach them because they believe what they do is not against God's rules. It's according to the Quran, it's according to their holy book. And that's why we had this passion in our heart to approach these women, to talk to them about Jesus. Because most of these women were widows, they did not have jobs. Some of them had to support themselves and support their children because, again, according to the Quran, women do not have equal rights with men. They cannot find job in Iran, and they do not have the rights of custody for their children. Always they have to fight for their rights. That's why most of them are so vulnerable, as you said, and they need support from a man, and that's why they marry these men temporarily. And it was difficult for us to find these women. We started with 2 women. We found them by accident, and those 2 women introduced us to others. And our group grows. And when we talk to them about God's forgiveness in Jesus, when we talk to them about God's love and grace, they could not believe it. They could not accept it because the God that Islam introduced to them is completely different, and they could not believe that God loves them even in that situation. Even, when we share with them that what they are doing, it's a sin, it's against God's rules, they were so disappointed, and they wanted to hear about the way that they can run away from this life. But for most of them, it was difficult because they needed support. And we always shared stories in the Bible about the interaction of Jesus with women, and that was very encouraging for them. And because of that experience that we had in Iran, we had a trip to India in 2006 to visit prostitutes in India, to have more experience. And we understood that prostitution in India is completely different than Iran. In Iran, it's very difficult to find these women, to work with them, and to educate them first about Islam, then the differences between Islam and Christianity. Praise God, we could talk to many prostitutes in Iran, and we could share the message of Jesus with them.
That's a wonderful picture. I can only imagine their response to the whole idea of grace and to forgiveness. It's beautiful. Well, when these ladies were arrested very abruptly, they weren't sure what was going to happen next, and they were first taken to a detention center. If you can imagine this, for the first 14 days, they had no shower, they could not brush their teeth, they couldn't take care of themselves at all, and they kept trying to find out through these interrogations what was going to happen to them. And as I told you, Evin Prison itself is a place with just terrible, terrible conditions. And yet, in some very practical ways, you were able to show the love of Christ to the women and also to the guards. Marzia, can you tell us more about that?
Yes, for the first 15 days when we got arrested, they sent us to a detention, and we had to stay there for 15 days. It was a horrible place, and I remember for the first week we were praying for our release because the condition was so difficult. It was a narrow corridor with very small cells that just 2-3 women, in some of them 2-3 women just they could lay. And it was winter, and that horrible detention. Was so cold. For 5 days, we didn't have food, and there wasn't light, and everything was so difficult. And we were just praying to release, for our release.
We
And-
understand that. I would be praying for my release
Yes.
too.
And and also there was some blanket. I'm trying to give you some image about that place. Even it's difficult. There was some blanket that they were wet. They were full of urine. And later we had to use those blankets. It was winter. It was cold. And later we understood because they locked the cells from 8 at night until 8 in the morning. And even we couldn't use the restroom. And there were many people, prisoners like prostitutes, addicted, homeless people in that detention. And later, when we saw those prisoners, we understood that God has a plan for us to be here. And we saw there are many prostitutes. And Mariam explained we already had a house church for prostitutes. And then in detention, we could see there are many prostitutes here, even their madams. And we start talking to them and share about the message of salvation with them. And it was we had a great time with them. Sometimes we gather in one cell and pray together. Some of them, they pray, they confess their sins. Mariam explained people, they couldn't understand about God's love and grace. When we shared our story with them and told them about Jesus and his love, they couldn't believe this, and they start crying. They ask us, "Is it possible?" Because they told us we are sinner. How it's possible that God loves us? And we had a great time with most of them, and it was like a church for us. And we understood that, you know, it's God's will to be in this prison, to spend time with those prisoners. And we believe that, you know, our image about church completely changed. Before going to prison, we had a different picture about church. We were thinking church is just a building that we attend and worship, enjoy. But we believe that detention and that prison, later Evin prison, became our church, because we every day we gather, we prayed, and they shared their stories with us, and it was a great fellowship with most of them. And also, when we were in detention, for the first few days, the guards' behavior was very brutal with us, and they feed prisoners like animal. And we try to respect them, to be nice with them, and even and also we started to clean that detention, because it was very dirty, and it was a place for prisoners. Just they spend a few days and then they transfer to court, and maybe they get released. They got released, or maybe they send them to another prison. That's why nobody care about the cleaning, and that's why we asked them to give us some supplies, and we started to clean that place and restroom everywhere. And all these behaviors, you know, affect them. We try to show them who Jesus is, what his teachings are, by our behaviors rather than our words, by respecting them rather than criticizing them, by you know, loving them. And all these behaviors affect their behaviors, and they started to respect us. And I remember in the 15 days that we were in detention, some of the guards came to us and asked us to pray for them and to forgive them. And they ask us, they take our hands behind the bars and ask us to pray for them, which was unusual. And we believe that it was a miracle that God changed that place for us. And the day that we were leaving that detention, we decided it was the last day. Nobody was in that detention. They sent all the prisoners to the court and other prison. we decided to write some verses on the walls and on the ceiling because we thought this is a place that many prisoners come to this place. That's why we decided to write some verses for prisoners after us, and they can see those verses, and it's very helpful for them. After leaving that detention, they sent us to Evin prison, which is notorious for arresting, raping, torturing, and executing of many innocent people. And we understood there are many, also there are many intellectual people, respectful people like students, lawyers, journalists, even doctors who their beliefs are against, just their belief are against the Iranian government. And we had a great opportunity there to share about the message of salvation with many of prisoners. And also they sent us to another building in Evin prison, which is famous. It's 209, and it's a solitary confinement for political prisoners. And we were separated at that time for 38. Every week we had a heavy interrogation for long hours, 9 hours. We had to sit on a metal church and heavy interrogation. And also the condition in prison was so difficult. We were so sick, and I had so much problems, and every day I had so much pain in my body. And there was just a clinic, very small and dirty clinic that without adequate equipment. And also we saw many injustices in that prison. We believe that one of the most painful of our experiences in Evin prison was execution of prisoners with whom we were living every day. And one day they took one of them and they execute that prisoners. And I can say after, we hadn't experienced such a thing before. And after those executions, we could feel the spirit of sorrow and death, and there was deadly silence everywhere. And sometimes we stared at each other, but we had no power to speak. And also they executed one of our best friend, Shirin. She was just 28 years old. She was a Kurdish. And it was very painful for both of us. And we experienced many injustices, many brutal behaviors. But we tried to show Jesus by our behaviors. And I remember, for 9 months, we didn't have Bible in prison. And every day we remember all verses in Bible, because we were facing with those verses how we can forgive our enemies, because the guards' behavior was so brutal with us. They insult us, and it's not easy. And sometimes we think we read the verses, but when we face with those verses, it's not easy. And we learned how to live with those verses and to be patient. And about suffers, we taste a little of, I believe that God let us to taste a little of his suffers. And it was really an honor for both of us that we could experience this and we could serve those people in prison.
Your book has so many stories of women who you came across there for sometimes short periods of time and sometimes longer. You mentioned the woman that was executed that you had gotten to know and how incredibly painful that must have been. But can you tell us one other story of a woman who you were able to show the love of Jesus to?
Yes, there are many prisoners that we shared with them, and they could see the miracles through our prayers. And it was interesting that some of them, they came to us that we are praying every day, we are practicing Islamic rules, but God don't answer our prayers. What is the reason why when you pray, God answers your prayers? And we had many experiences like this, and we could see that God is working through our prayers, and God is doing miracles. And there were many. If I want to share one of them, she was... when I was in 209, the building that was for political prisoners, it was a solitary cells, and it was very small. I was with a cellmate. She was just 18 years old. when I say political prisoners, it doesn't mean that they did something wrong. You know, it's just their belief is against the Iranian government. And she was just only 18 years old, and her dad was belonged to a political group. And that's why they arrested her daughter in order to force her dad. And she was with me every day. She was in solitary cell for 8 months, and every day she was crying, and she was very hopeless. And I believe that it was God's will for me to be in that cell with her in order to encourage her. And I tried. I made a fellowship with her. We built a friendship together, and every day I tried to cheer her up and talk to her. And she was practicing namaz every day.
Can you explain what that is?
Yes, it's a prayer that Muslims 5 times a day, they just practice this. They bend several times in front of God and say some Arabic words, which is not our language, Farsi. And they have to cover themselves to practicing namaz. And she was praying namaz every day, and I was looking at her. And I started to asking some question to challenge her. For example, I asked her, why you speak with God in Arabic, which is not your language, Farsi? Why, when you want to pray namaz, you cover yourself in front of a God who created you? Every day, I was trying to challenge her by asking those questions. And one day she came to me and told me, Marzieh, you are exactly right. I was thinking about your questions. When I pray, when I see you pray with your language, and when I pray with you, I feel more peace and joy, rather than just practicing this rule, which is an obligation rules that I just do it. I don't have anything from this practicing. And she decided to quit her namaz, and after that she started to pray with me, and she gave her heart to Jesus, and she became more, hopeful about her future, about God. And it was interesting that after that she shared with me. She told me that before I came to this cell, her interrogators told her that we are going to send you to this cell. There is a girl in this cell that she converted from Islam to Christianity. We are going to send you to this cell in order to change her. And it was interesting that she was changed, and the guards were watching, and sometimes they watching from the window. And when they realized that she quit her namaz, they became very angry, and they talked to her that, what happened to you? We sent you to this cell to change her, but now you are quitting your namaz. And it was so funny, and she was angry, and she told me that I told my interrogator she's a great girl, I don't have any problem with her faith, and they threaten her that why you quit her namaz, we will informing your family. And they called her family and talked to her mom, but she told me I don't have any problem with my family. And when they visited her, she explained for them and told them, when I got released, I will explain for you why I changed. And it was very interesting. It was a miracle.
I bet they were very careful who they put in your cell after that, 'cause their little plan didn't work there. Well, one more question for you, Mariam. As you look at all of us suburban women in Chicago, you were able to be a bright light for Christ in an incredibly courageous way in a very difficult situation. But what would you say to us as you look out at this women, and go ahead, you have permission to challenge us, and what would you say to us as we live in, now you've lived in our country for a couple years. You told me that you find that it was actually almost easier to evangelize in Iran than it is here in the States for lots of reasons, which is really interesting. But what would you say to us? We're ready, we're eager, we want to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. When we left prison, we promised most of the women in prison to share their stories with the world and to be a voice for them. That's why we are here. We travel and we speak because we believe that we are responsible. And also we believe that God is using our message, the message of our book and our story here in the U.S. to send his message to Christians in this country. We believe that God has a plan for American church. And we always encourage Americans not to take their freedom for granted because, you know, we are two examples here. And we know that there are thousands of people, innocent people like us, who are in different prisons just because of their faith in Jesus. This is the right, the simple right that every single person is allowed to have to choose how they want to worship God, to choose to which God they want to believe. But we don't have this right in many countries like Iran. You have this right in this country, and you know how it is that when you have something, you don't appreciate it. When you lose it, you appreciate it. But we are not going to wait for that moment, you know, for the persecution to come to this country to appreciate this freedom. We believe that the freedom that we have in this country is really a blessing and a valuable gift from God, and we must praise God for this freedom. Also, we believe that we are responsible for those who are living in persecution. It's not like, you know, we moved to America and we are living in freedom, we can live for ourselves. We are responsible for those who need our support, and that's why we wrote our book, Captive in Iran. That's why we speak about the message of our book. We share our stories with other Christians or non-Christians. We started something. We have a website. We put the names of prisoners and address of prisons. And we always encourage people to just pick one prisoner and start advocating for that prisoner by praying and sending letter to prison. Because we experienced this when we were in Evin prison. For a few first months, we felt very lonely, and we thought that we had been completely forgotten by the world. But when we heard that many Christians from all around the world were supporting us, either by praying or sending letter to prison, we became so encouraged, and we understood that we have a big Christian family who were supporting us. And also, we believe that God is using this support. God is using, for example, sending letter to prisoner. He's using this to send his message to the government, to the guards. We were in prison for 9 months, and we received thousands of letters, but they didn't let us to see even one letter. But we heard that our judges forced some of the guards to open the letters and to check them, and some of the guards came to us and asked us, what does it mean, Jesus is our shepherd? Because many people wrote this verse for you. And we understood that God was even using those letters to send his message to the guards in prison. That's why it's very important to be a voice for those people. We are here, we are just two, but we need your help, we need your support to help us to raise voices for those who need our support, who need our help. There are many Christians in prison. We know about our country, Iran. I'm sure you heard about some of them, the American pastor, for example, who is in prison for a year, and his wife is here advocating for him. And there are many other prisoners that nobody knows them. Some of them are, have someone outside Iran, and some of them are already in the news, but some of those prisoners do not have any voice, and they need our support, and then they need our help.